Okay, we're up to Daf Ayin Vav Amid Aleph. We're up to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, the Mishnah is describing treifas, back to treifas, which part of the animal that gets injured would cause the animal to be a treifa. So the Mishnah says, Behema shenechtecha ragleha min akuva lamata. If an animal, on one of its legs, it gets cut, there's a break in the bone. Gemara is going to point out not just break in the bone, but the break in everything, sinews, whatever. So if it's below the arkuva, now the arkuva is really like the knee joint. If it's below the knee, then it's kosher. And arkuva lamayla, psula. But if it's above the knee, then it's puzzle. Now, what's going to cause a little bit of trickiness is that, unlike humans, cows have two knees. Hold on once.
Progress.
So I was saying is that cows have two knees. They have a lower knee and an upper knee. What the Gemara is going to try to figure out is which knee is this referring to, that if it's below it, if there's a break below it, it's not a treifa, a break below it is a treifa. Is this the lower knee, the upper knee? One other thing to know about the anatomy of these animals is that on the lower knee, right above the lower knee, at the top of the lower knee, there are gidin. There's called sumas hagidin. Sumas hagidin are three large sinews. So that's by the lower knee. So the Mishnah says if there's a break by the knee, below the knee it's kosher, above the knee it's treif. Second halacha, b'chei shenitel tzumas hagidin. If they break the sinews, if the sinews snap, the animal's also treifa. Now, the last halacha of the Mishnah is not really referring to treifas, but it's referring to a discussion we had over the past previous dafim, which is nishbar hetzam. If there was a break in a fracture, and let's say in an area that doesn't cause a treifa. The question is, does the shechita remove the tumas nevela from that limb? In other words, do we look at the limb that's broken, that's dangling from the animal, do we look at it as a chelik of the animal? You can't eat that part. The question is, though, is the shechita mater removes the tumah? Or do we look at it, no, as if it's completely separate and it's evim and achad? So nishbar etzam, imroiv basar kayim. If in addition to a break in the bone, so if most of the flesh around the bone is still intact, so the animal, so that aver is still really connected, then shchita semetarasai, then the shchita removes the tumah, and you'd be allowed to eat it because it's considered part of the animal. But if there's a break in the bone and most of the flesh around the bone is also broken, then halach is that limb is already considered as if it's removed. It's evim and achai, and ein shchitasai metarasai. And therefore, its status as tumas nevela, as we've had over the last week or two. Now, the Mishnah had said if there's a break below the bone, below the arkuva, below the knee, then it's kosher. Above the knee, it's treif. Now, the question is, which knee? Is it the lower knee or the upper knee of the cow? So, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Merav, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Merav, Rabbi Yehuda Merav just said, Lamata, Nakuva, Lamai, Lamai, Nakuva. Below the knee and above the knee, but he didn't say which one. So the Gemara says, Be'ez arkuva amru, which knee is he referring to? Barkuva nim karasim arosh. The first opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Merav, in the name of Chia, is that it's the arkuva that is sold with the head. That was just, apparently the lower knee was a cheaper quality of meat, they would sell it with the head. In other words, it's the lower knee. So he's referring to the lower knee. So if there's a break below the lower knee, it's treif. Below the lower knee, it's fine. Above the lower knee, right, the top of the lower knee, meaning you have to think of like a human knee, right below it, kosher, right above it is treif. Now there's going to be an issue with this sheet. I'll just point this out now. The Mishnah is saying is that if there's a break below the knee, it's the lower knee, it's kosher. Above the lower knee, it's treif. The problem is, above the lower knee is the tzumas hagidin. So why does the Mishnah have to say that if there's a break, it's treif? What's the next case in the Mishnah? And also the tzumas hagidin are broken. If you're telling me that the knee is the upper knee, fine, because the upper knee is nowhere near the tzumas hagidin. Tzumas hagidin is by the lower knee. So if you're telling me that arkuva lamata, arkuva lamayla is the upper knee, so okay, fine. So there's two separate categories. There's the upper knee, which causes a treifa, and then there's tzumas hagidin, which is not in that part of the body. But if you're telling me that we're dealing with the lower knee, and the break below is kosher, break above is treif, a break above the lower knee is where the tzumas hagidin are. So that's basically the same thing. So why does the Mishnah have to have two cases of a break above the lower knee, which is treif, and tzumas hagidin when they're in the same part of the anatomy of the cow? The Gemara is going to point this out. That's the first opinion, is that the arkuva is the lower knee. Ulam Rav Oishia keneged begamel nikar. Ulam Rav Oishia says no, it's the upper knee, which is where you could see it by a camel. The upper knee by a cow is covered by its fat. It's covered by meat, and you can't really see the movement of it. By a camel, the upper knee, it's pretty drastic of how you could see it sticking out. So the point is, it's the upper knee. So there's two different opinions, either lower knee or the upper knee. Says the Gemara The Gemara points out the problem with the first opinion that I mentioned before, which is that the first opinion says that the Mishnah, the Akuva, is the lower knee, which is below it is kosher, above it is streif. The problem is above it is mamish where the tumas hagidin are. So why does it have to have a separate case? That the Mishnah says that if there's a break above the lower knee, it's treif, and then it says tumas hagidin is also treif. They're the same spot of the body. So it says the Gemara, Amr le Ula Rav Yehuda. Ula said to Rav Yehuda, according to me, that we're dealing with the upper knee, which is nowhere near the tumas hagidin. So then it makes sense. Then the Mishnah flows nicely. That if there's a break by the top of the above the upper knee, it's treif. Below the upper knee is not treif. And there's a separate halacha, is that if you rip the tzumas hagidin, if it tears the sinews, it's treif, because the sinews are nowhere near the upper knee. But according to you, but according to you, that we're talking about the lower knee is where the tzumas hagidin are. So why is it two separate cases? L'chara, it's saying the same thing, which is that if there's a break below, above the upper knee, which is where the tzumas hagidin are, it's treif. So Amrle, rukuva b'lei tzumas hagidin, tzumas hagidin b'lei rukuva. So he says maybe the Mishnah really is two cases. How so? If the break is happening where the tumas hagidin are, how is it two cases? So he says maybe the Mishnah has two separate cases. One is where the tumas hagidin are snapped, which are sinew snapped without affecting the bone. And the other one, when it says in the first line in the Mishnah that behema shenechtechu ragleha by the kuva l'mayla, it's referring to the area of the sinews, but the shenechtechu means that there's a break of the bone but not the sinews. Meaning, the two cases are a break in the bone but the sinews are intact, or a break in the sinews but the bone is intact. Maybe that's why it's two cases. The problem is, says the Gemara, hanechtechu katani. It can't work. Why? Don't tell me that the case in the Mishnah, where there's a break in the bone, but the sinews are intact, the lashon of the Mishnah is nechtechu. Nechtechu implies a severance of everything, not just the bone, everything in that area. So it can't be that you're telling me that it's a break in the bone, but the sinews are intact. It doesn't work. The lashon does not mashma that way. And therefore, the Gemara is leaving it off with a problem with this shita, that according to the Rabbi Yehuda Marav, that the knee that the Mishnah is referring to, the lower knee, which is where the tumas hagidin are, so how are there two cases? It says below the lower knee is kosher, above the knee, which is the lower knee, is treif. That's where the tumas hagidin are. So why do you need a separate case of tumas hagidin? So the Gemara says, Ishtik, Rav Yehuda was quiet. After Ula left, Rav Yehuda said to himself, my time I have an answer. I could have an answer. What's the answer? Maybe the Mishnah is referring to like this. Maybe this is how you're supposed to read the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says there's a break below the knee and above the knee, maybe it's talking about two separate knees. Meaning, maybe the Mishnah means like this. Below the knee that it's kosher is the lower knee. Above the knee that's treif is the upper knee. So we're talking about two separate knees. And then there's a separate halacha that if there's a break in the tzumas hagidin, it's also treif. So we thought we were talking about one knee, below and above said knee, either lower knee or upper knee. Maybe it means a break below the lower knee is kosher, and a break above the upper knee is treif. And the Mishnah is taka not talking about the area of the tzumas hagidin. Maybe that could have been an answer I could have said. The Gemara, though, is going to respond, the lashon's not mashma that way. That was why it's good if you didn't say that, because Ula would not accept that. Ula was a very stickler for the lashon. The lashon of the Mishnah implies that we're dealing with one area of the body, the lower knee or the upper knee, not the lower knee and the upper knee. Says the Gemara, my time Hadar Amar, but to that he realized it would not have been a good answer. Ula did not like when he mentioned before the option of breaking the bone without the tzumas hagidin, because nechtecha implies a clean break. So you see that Ula was a stickler for the lashon. So if Ula is a stickler for the lashon, he's not going to be happy with saying that it's the lower knee and the upper knee. It doesn't work. He would want it to be one part of the body. Now, a different version of this Rav Yehuda Marav, Rav Papa Masni Hachi. Rav Papa had a different version of this conversation. Rav Yehuda Marav Rav Chia, Lamata Manakuv Mutzu Samagidin, Lamai Manakuv Mutzu Masagidin, the Cheshanita Tzumasagidin, Varkuva Gufa, Keduula Rav Oishia. According to this version, it sounds like what this version is taka. This is what Rav Yehuda Marav Taka said, that the below the knee is the lower knee and it's kosher. Above the knee that's treif is the upper knee. And the knee itself is also a problem. So Hitaka, this Havamina that he rejected, according to this version, that was the conclusion. Now the Gemara just has an interesting point. According to, let's say, Ula, that it's the upper knee. So you're telling me, so it's nowhere near the tzumas hagidin. So the tzumas hagidin is by the lower knee. If there's a snap over there, it's treif. If there's a snap above the upper knee, it's also treif. But between the lower knee and the upper knee, if there were a snap there, it's kosher. That's if you understand the anatomy well, that's what Ula concludes. Because there's a break in the lower knee by the sinews, it's going to be treif. Then the arkuva, according to Ula, is the upper knee. So if it's a break above the upper knee, it's treif. Below the upper knee is kosher. So you're telling me that just within the, let's say, the thigh of the animal, if there's a break in part A, it's kosher, and like 2 inches above it, it's treif. The Gemara just feel that that's a strange thing. Why would that be? Just in Metzias wise. So the Gemara responds, that's not a kasha. All of treifus is like this. There's a puncture over here, it's going to live. A puncture over here, it's going to die. The answer is that's the anatomy of an animal. You can ask kashas. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Ashi, treifus kamedami adadi. Were you trying to ask kashas on treifus? You're trying to get like a, compare one part of the body to the other and say, well, if there's a severance here, it's going to live over there. That should also live. It doesn't work like that. That's not how it works by treifus. It's metzias. If you cut an animal over here, it'll die. If you cut an animal over there, it's not going to die. Does it make sense? No, that's the metzias. Okay, we said before if there was a break by the tzumas agidin, which means that if the sinews are snapped by the lower knee, it's treif. Now apparently there are 3 main sinews by the lower knee of the cow. Cows have 3, chickens have 16, but cows have 3. Now, the reality is that there's 3. One of them is much thicker. One of them is much larger than the other 2 combined. So you have 1 big one and then 2 of the smaller ones, combining of 3. Rabbi Amar of Ashi, the argami ulavar. So basically, it's all by the knee, the lower knee of the cow. The article has a picture. There's 3 parts of the lower knee. In that little area, let's say the 3 inches. There's the top, middle, and the bottom. So Rabba Amar Rav Ashi, the agma lavar. The area that we say that if it snaps the sinews, that it's treif, that's the top part of the knee. The top, let's say, inch of the knee. Rabbi Rav Huna Amar Rav Ashi, the agam logav. It's from, the actual middle of the knee itself. And Rabbi Breder of Huna Amar Rav Ashi, the ale arkuma. It's the lower part of that knee. So it's just a machlekes of which part snapping would cause it to be a treifa. Yosef Hahumar Rabbanan Kamei of Abba v'Yosef v'Kamri. The arkuma gufa. What about the actual middle of the knee itself? Meaning the arkuma gufa. I'm sorry. He's saying that the middle of the knee itself is also treif. Not just the top part, but the middle of the knee itself also would be treif. Amarle Rav Abba says, Loita tzitzile, don't listen to him, he's being machmer. Hachi Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said the following rule of what part of the sinew snapping would cause the animal to be treif. Hecha de pari tavcha. If it's in an area of the knee that the butchers cut open, that they cut open that part of the knee, apparently that's part of the butchers when they're deveining the knee, they cut that part of the knee. So that's where it's treif. But above that, it's not going to be treif. And that's the last opinion, which is only the lower part of the knee would cause the animal to be treif, but middle and upward is not going to cause it to be a treifa. This sumas agidin, because again, the gidin continue up the leg. At some point, it just becomes flesh. So he's saying sumas agidin shamru. This part of the sinews, makom shagidin simson. It's where the sinews are joined together to the bone. Vad kama. Now, how far up the bone? So they start at the knee. How far up is it a problem? At some point, it stops being a problem. Sometimes it's the thigh. So ad kama. Amalehu merabon Rav Yaakov Shemei ki avinu berav Yehuda Amerlon Shimu b'nei Milson the Megav Rabbi Shmuel Manu Shmuel. I have a chiddush from a great rabbi named Shmuel. Tzumas Yagidin Sha'amru. This part of the sinews, makom shagidin Simson boy, umakom shetzimson amakom shemispashtin. It's from the place that the sinews are joined to the knee until they're part of the thigh. Meaning, in other words, there's a area of the knee upwards where if there's a snap, it's going to be treif. V'kama, and how big is that area? Amar Abaya arba badati batura. For an ox, it's 4 finger lengths from the knee upwards. So from the knee and then 4 finger lengths up into the thigh. That's where it causes a treif by a ox. Bedakama. What about a small animal like a sheep or a goat? Amar Abaya. The rule is like this. It's not a distance, but rather this is the rule. Baliti hamatzumas agidin. Where the sinews protrude outwards, that's for sure going to be a treif. Bali, where the tzumas agidin, where the sinews are now flush into the flesh and just become part of the thigh, lo have a tzumas agidin. That's not going to be a treif anymore. Ashuni have it sumasagidin. If they're hard, then they are. It is going to be treif if they're snapped. Rakivi, if there's a part where they're soft, loy have it sumasagidin. It's not going to be treif. Alimi, if they're thick, have it sumasagidin. Katini loy have it sumasagidin. But if they're thin, they're not sumasagidin. Chivari, these are just rules, I guess. Chivari, if they're white, have it sumasagidin. That's a part that if it snaps, it's going to be treif. Loy chivari, but if they're not white, loy have it sumasagidin. Go to the next page. Mar Baravashi Omar, Mar Baravashi says, Kivan de Zigi, once they become pale, Avagav de chivari, even if they're not white, it's a problem. That if they snap, it's going to be treif. Again, there's three of them. One of them being very, very thick, and the other two are not combined. They're not as thick as the third. So, Amar, the question is, how many of them have to snap? You could argue all of them have to snap. You could argue roiv, 2 out of 3, or you could argue just the thick one snapping is roiv because it's roiv in thickness, because it's thicker than the other two combined. So, Amar Amemar Shreder Zvid, the 3 strands of sinews in the Tzumas Hagidin, Chad Alima B'Trei Katini. There's one that's very thick, and there's 2 that are thinner than the other one. Those 2 are not as combined as thick as the other one. So there's 2 small ones and 1 bigger one. So if Sikalima, if the thicker one is severed, oz the roiv binyan, it's treif, because in thickness you lost roiv. If sikatini, and let's say instead of the thick one snapping, the 2 small ones snapping, then oz the roiv minyan, it's also going to be treif because roiv of the sinews are snapped. So in other words, for it to be treif, either the thick one has to snap, or the 2 thin ones. But that would make it treif. So you either lose a roiv of thickness or roiv of the sinews itself. Mar Bravashi Masi Lakula. Mar Bravashi said, no, it's the opposite. You're telling me, you're being strict. You're saying that it can be treif by either snapping the thick one or snapping the 2 thin ones. So there's multiple options for it to be treif. He says, no, I think it's to be meko. The ifsik katini, ifsik alima ha'ikar of minin, ifsik katina ikar of minin. He says, I hold the opposite. For it to be treif, you have to lose both. You have to snap the 2 thin ones and the big one. Meaning, in other words, all 3 have to be snapped because you need roiv legamri. You need roiv, or you could actually have the thick one and one of the thin ones snapping. You need to lose rove thickness and rove of the amount. So 2 out of 3, but you need the thick one and one of the thin ones for it to be treif. He's more makel. Now this is by a cow which has 3 sinews. Oif is by birds. Shitzachuti have. There's 16 sinews by the drumstick. Ipasichad minayu treif, and if one of them is snapped, it's treif. Now the Gemara just points out, Amar Mar Bar Ravashi Havaina Kameder the Abba. I was once by my father Ravashi. And they brought a chicken. Ubadik veshkech chamesar, and he found only 15 sinews. So one of them was obviously snapped. So he wanted to treif it up. But but he noticed that one strand was thicker than the other 2. Nifsik, he peeled back the ishkech tray, and he realized that one strand was actually 2 of them together. In other words, apparently sometimes the sinews will sort of join together, so it's not. So you might count 15. It doesn't mean that one snapped. You just have to look beneath the surface. The 16th might be there, so you have to just know how to look and know how to investigate. Amar Rav Yehuda Merav, Tzumas Hagidin Sha'amru. This Tzumas Hagidin, where you have these 3 sinews, it becomes treif b'roiv if you sever roiv. Now, my rubai, what does that mean? That could mean roiv. There's 3, that means 2 out of 3, or maybe roiv of one of them is enough. My roiv, rubai echad mehen. Be very strict. It's one of them. You don't even have to snap one of them. If roiv of one of them is snapped, it's already treif. Kamrisa kamei de Shmuel, Amar Li, when I was by Shmuel, he said the opposite. He said, no, michti tlasahav. There's 3 sinews. Even if one of them snapped legamri, you still have 2. In other words, the first opinion, Rav Yehuda Merav is saying that if roiv of one of them is snapped, it's already treif. He says, no, even if one of them is entirely snapped, you still have 2. You have to snap 2 out of 3. This is not like Rabbanoi. He said that you have Rav Yehuda Merav is roiv if one of them is treif. Then you have Shmuel who says, no, you have to snap 2 of them to be treif. This is not like the Rabbanoi. Rabbanoi said, even if 2 of them are snapped, and the third one only has a strand left, it's still kosher. I mean, according to Rabbanoi, you need to snap all 3 for it to be treif. Ikadamri, some have a different version. My Rubai, that what Rav Yehuda Merav, when he said that if there's a snap of roiv, it's treif, Rubai kol echad ve'echad, not roiv of one, roiv of each of them. Meaning you need three of them to have roiv. Let's say each one of the three, roiv of it has to be cut. The Gemara says, to that Shmuel said, no. Even if roiv of each of them are snapped, they're still intact. You need all of them to be cut. And Messiah the Rabbi, and this is like Rabbi, because Rabbi Taka said that for it to be treif, you need all three to be cut. Okay. Now, the Mishnah had said that if, this is the last sugi of the day, the Mishnah had said that if there's a break in one of the bones, and it's not a bone that'll cause it to be treif, the halacha is, if the bone and roiv of the flesh, and the flesh around it is cut, even if it's dangling by the skin, that aver you can't eat, and it's aver menachai, the shchita is not metarit. Says the Gemara, Amarav, l'mayla min akuva. If there's a fracture above the lower knee, so now it would make it a treifa. Hold on a second, we got a B here. Im roiv. We're going to pause.
In progress.
So I'm sorry. So the Gemara is saying nishbar etzim, if there's a fracture. So Amarav, l'mayla min akuva. If the fracture happens above the lower knee, so then that's an area that would cause the animal to be treif. So imroiv habasar kayim, if in addition to the break of the bone, if the bone broke, but the flesh around the bone is intact, it didn't sever, zev zemuter, it's not a treifa. You could eat the animal, and you could eat the limb as well, because the limb is considered connected. Imlav, but if there's a break of the bone, and the flesh around it, al pi roiv, is severed, zev is aser, the entire animal is a treifa. Not only is that limb aser, but the animal is a treifa as well. Now that's because the break happened in an area that the limb would cause to be a treifa. But lamatim and akuva, let's say there's a break below the knee, so it's not going to be treifa there anyway. So then there's just a shayla of, is the animal's limb considered connected to the body, or is it considered dangling, and then not included in the shechita? So lamatim and akuva, if it's below the knee, imroiv habasar kayim, if in addition to the break, if despite the break, roiv of the flesh is intact, zev is mutter. You could eat the animal because it's not a treifa, and the limb is considered connected to the body, so it's kosher. Bimlav. But if roiv of the flesh is broken in addition to the break, aver aser behema mutter. You could eat the behema. But the aver is going to be aser. The aver is going to be aser. In other words, we look at the dangling limb as if it's disconnected from the body, and it's aver menachai. This is familiar what we've had. That you could have the entire, and it's an interesting mitzvah, that you could have the entire animal to be kosher, but that limb is going to be treif. That limb is going to be an aver menachai. That limb is going to be an aveil, not treif. It's going to be aver menachai. Shmuel says no. Bein lamayla, bein lamata, im reiva basar kaim zev mutter, im lav, Ever aser ubehem muteres. Shmuel says no. Whether it's above the knee or below the knee, if roiv basar is kayim, then it's going to be kosher. Imlav. But if roiv basar is not kayim, even above the knee, ever aser ubehem muteres. Meaning, according to Shmuel, above the knee, it's going to be a problem. Above the knee is not going to cause the animal to be a treifa.
In progress.
And according to Shmuel, even if there's a break above the knee and roiv of the basar is going to be cut, it's not going to cause the animal to be a treifa. That's the difference between Rabbi and Shmuel. The difference is if there's a break above the knee, would it cause the animal to be a treifa? So it says the Gemara Maskeh or Nachman asks Shmuel the following question: L'Shmuel yoimru ever mimenu mutal ba'ashba muteres. According to Shmuel, that means that you could have the whole body of the animal to be kosher except the limb. It's such a strange thing. How could that be? The problem with that kasha is, according to everybody, it's like that. Even if there's a break below the knee, according to Rav, you'll have the entire animal to be kosher except that limb. That lives Ev Menachai. So why is that a kasha on Shmuel? Amr le Rav Acha bar Rav Huna le Rav Nachman le Rav Nami. Yoimru Ev menu mutav ashma muteres. So why is it a kasha on Shmuel? It's a kasha in general. You have a weird mitzvah that you could have the animal to be kosher except for a limb. If you're bothered by that, then why are you addressing it to Shmuel directly? It should be a kasha according to everybody. So Amalei, he responded, no. My kasha is not that you could have a metzias, that roiv of the body is kosher except for a limb. That I'm used to. But to have a break above the knee, which is in part of the animal. The animal, it's a very vital part of the animal. To have a break above the knee and not make a treifa, that's confusing to me. That you could have that part of the limb considered disconnect, and the animal to be kosher. He says that part is the confusing part. Now you have this machlokes, Rav and Shmuel shalchu mitam. They sent a message from Eretz Yisrael. Hilchos kavasi de Rav. We paskin like Rav. Hardu shalchu kavesi de Shmuel. But then they sent a message that we paskin like Shmuel. Hardu shalchu kavesi de Rav. And then they sent another message that we paskin like Rav. So they go back and forth. Rav, Shmuel, Rav. The aver atzmai mitame kemasa. But even though we pass like Rav, that limb that is considered disconnected is it's considered a tameh, meaning that it has the same degree of tumah as an avela. The dangling limb is considered evim menachai, and therefore the shechita is not matter that limb. The problem is, Masav Rav Chizda says, I don't understand. Isn't there a brisa? We had this previously. We had this 4 days ago. That there's a brisa that says that if there's a limb that's dangling from the body, even though the limb cannot be consumed, the shechita removes the tumah. We had this mefurish a brisa from Rav Meir. Rav Meir says, "Loi im tiharta shechita treifa oisa ves ever hamedullaba." Rav Meir said mefurish that if you shecht an animal and there's a limb that's hanging off, the limb is considered. You can't consume the limb, but the shechita removes the tumas ever menachai. So why are we saying that the limb is considered tameh? Didn't Rav Meir say mefurish in a brisa that it removes the tumah? So over that's the brisa of mefurish that Rav Meir said that the shechita removes the tumah of that limb. The Gemara just has a quick point. It's a good question. The Gemara just wants to know, why did you have to ask it from a brisa when there's a Mishnah that similarly implies it? The brisa is more mefurish, but the Mishnah also implies that way. And anytime you can ask a kasha from a Mishnah, it's always better than a brisa. Amalei Rabba said, Haduri apircha lamalach. Why are you looking for brisas from the question? Oisim asis, and ask kasha from the Mishnah. That this Mishnah is a Mishnah that we haven't had yet. It's in 2 months. It says nishchata behema. If you shecht an animal and it has a limb that's dangling off it, hochshur b'dameha, the dangling limb becomes roy lekabel tuma through the blood of the animal, through the blood of the shechita. Meaning, even though the blood of the shechita, right, for food to become roy lekabel tum, it has to come in contact with a liquid. What's the liquid? So when you shecht an animal, the blood touches that neck. So the Gemara says, that when you shecht the animal, even though the blood does not touch that limb, but it touches the animal itself, and that's enough to make the limb roy lekabel tumah. That's Rav Meir Shita, and Rav Shimon disagrees. He says, no, loy hochsher, that because the blood did not touch the limb that's dangling off, is not yet roy lekabel tumah. What you do see is that both Rav Meir and Rav Shimon say that it's not considered evim menachai. If it's considered evim menachai, if it's tummy automatically, it doesn't have to come in contact with the liquid. The fact that they're handling, whether it has to come in contact with the liquid indicates that it's not evim menachai. It means that the shechita removes the tumah. So that's a mefurish Mishnah. So why are you asking a kasha from a brisa when there's a Mishnah? So amarlei masisa nikalatchui kedachinon. The answer is that Mishnah is not a good stark raya, as we've already rejected previously. We had this a few days ago that we tried to bring a raya from that Mishnah, but the Gemara rejected it. The reason being is because you could argue that Mishnah is not referring to a limb that's hanging off. It's considered basar. It's referring to basar that's hanging off, and basar is not evim menachai b'chlal. But if there was a limb hanging off, maybe it would be evim menachai. So therefore, we asked the kasha from the brisa. Kisalek Rav Zera. At the end of the day, when Rav Zera went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkechelu Rav Yirmiyah di Yosef v'Karmel Hashmaita. He heard Rav Yirmiyah quoting Rav that the limb that's hanging off is tamei. Amarle Yasher v'Chin Targam Aryech beBavel. You're correct, and the great lion of Bavel said the same thing. Aryech Manu, who is that? Shmuel. Hamiflik Palig. Wait, didn't Rav and Shmuel argue? Wasn't that the whole point? That Rav and Shmuel argued about the lower break below the knee, above the knee. Hadabe Shmuel agabe the Rav. Shmuel eventually rescinded his view and followed the view of Rav. Just to finish up the daf, Tanu Rabbana, Nishbar Hatzim, if there's a bone that's fractured and the bone is actually coming through. So the question is, does that make the limb that the bone is coming through disconnected from the animal and make it as if it's Evim and Achai? So the rule is, Im'ar ubasar chayfin es ruboy. If skin and flesh around the bone is covering roiv, then it's mutter. Then it could still heal, and it's considered part of the body. Bim lav, but if not, if skin and the flesh are not covering roiv, then it's aser. Then that limb is considered disconnected from the body, even if it's not going to cause a treifa, and that part of the limb is considered evim and achai. The kama rubais, it has to cover roiv. What's roiv? Of the bone that's protruding. Ki aser of dimi amrav yechanan roiv avyoy. The majority of the thickness, including the marrow of the bone. Some say no, it has to be roiv of the circumference, has to be exposed. Therefore, in order for the limb to be permissible, it has to be covered by flesh and skin, both roiv of the circumference and roiv of the diameter. Skin is the same as flesh, meaning the same way if roiv of the fracture is covered by flesh, it's going to be kosher. So too, if right of the fracture is covered by skin, it's also going to be kosher. It's the same. You're telling me that you don't need roiv of basar or roiv of ar. It doesn't have to be a combination of the two. Either one is fine, but doesn't it say ar u basar, which implies it has to be 50-50? You need both roiv of ar and roiv of basar to cover the bone that's protruding for it to be kosher. So why are you saying roiv of one of them is enough? Anon ar oy basar tnan. We don't have the vav, we have the oy. Therefore, it's either flesh or skin. Either one is enough. It does not have to be a combination of the two. Just to finish up, some have a different version that Amar Ulam Rav Yechanan ar mitzdarf lebasar, that it has to be a combination of the two. It has to be half covered by skin and half covered by flesh for it to be kosher. But if it's a roiv of flesh or roiv of ar, it's not going to be enough. Why are you saying that 50-50 is enough? L'chora, you should have to have roiv basar and roiv ar, meaning it should have to be both, not 50-50. 50-50 implies that if, let's say, half covered by or and half covered by basar, that's enough. L'chora, you should need both. I have a maisa that tells me that you don't need both flesh and skin. Tahu bar guzla, because there was a certain pigeon, to have a bear of Yitzchak that they brought to Rav Yitzchak that had a broken leg, or mitzdarf lebasar hava, and it was a combination of half skin, half flesh covering that bone. Also, Rav Yechon said it's kosher, so you see you don't need both. A combination of the two is enough. Amar Lei in the Gemara, and so therefore he's applying that to an animal as well. Amar Lei, Rav Nachman responds, no, bar guzla comment, you can't compare a cow to a pigeon. Pigeon bar guzla derachich shani, but pigeon's skin is very soft, and therefore it has a status of basar. Basar by an or by a pigeon are the same, and therefore as long as it's covered majority by a combination of the two, it's fine. But it could be by a cow. You need both of them for it to be covered, for it to be kosher. I will stop.